You know that feeling when you finally find your perfect slice of heaven. That's exactly what happened when I bought my dream property last spring. 3 acres of pure paradise, nestled right up against Willow Creek, with massive oak trees that had been standing guard for probably 100 years. The realtor called it a fixer-upper, but I called it potential. I'm Sarah, by the way. I've been working in environmental regulation for 15 years, and I just got promoted to regional director for the State Environmental Protection Agency. Yeah, I'm basically the person who makes sure people don't mess with Mother Nature without proper permits, but more on that later. So there I was, standing on my back porch with my morning coffee, watching the creek babble past my property line. The previous owners had let everything go wild, which honestly was perfect for me. Native plants everywhere, a natural buffer zone along the water, and wildlife that actually wanted to stick around. It was like living in a nature documentary, but without the British narrator. The only problem: the creek had been slowly eating away at my bank for years. Nothing dramatic, just that gentle erosion that happens when water meets soil and time. I'd done my homework, pulled soil samples, checked flood maps, even called in a few favors to get a hydrologist friend to take a look. The solution was simple: some strategic terracing and native plantings to stabilize the bank. Textbook restoration work. I'd gotten my permits months ago. Every single one. Army Corps of Engineers permit for working near the waterway. State environmental permit for soil disturbance. County grading permit. Even checked with the city, though technically I was just outside their jurisdiction. I had more paperwork than a mortgage application, but everything was squeaky clean and legal. The plan was beautiful, actually. Create terrace levels using locally sourced stone, plant native grasses and wildflowers. Maybe add some willow saplings for extra erosion control. It would look like it had always been there, just better, more stable, more sustainable. I'd scheduled the work for early September, right after the summer heat broke, but before the fall rain started. Perfect timing. The contractor I hired, Miguel, was a wizard with this stuff. He'd done restoration work for the state before, and his crew knew exactly what they were doing. The bulldozer arrived on a Tuesday morning, not some massive earth-moving monster, just a compact dozer perfect for precision work. Miguel was already mapping out the first terrace level when I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine being pushed hard. A white Escalade came flying down my gravel driveway, kicking up dust like it was auditioning for an action movie. Behind the wheel was a woman I'd never seen before, wearing what looked like a full face of makeup at 8 in the morning and sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She slammed on the brakes, creating a dramatic dust cloud that would have made Hollywood proud, and practically launched herself out of the driver's seat. She was maybe 50, with that perfectly styled hair that doesn't move in hurricane force winds and a power walking outfit that screamed I demand to speak to managers for fun. "Excuse me," she shrieked, marching toward Miguel like she owned the place. "What do you think you're doing?" Miguel, bless his heart, looked at me with that universal expression of "Is this lady for real?" Then he politely explained that we were doing permitted erosion control work on private property. Private property, she laughed, but not in a fun way. More like a hyena discovering a wounded gazelle. "I don't think so. I'm Janet Henderson, president of the Creekside Meadows HOA, and this is absolutely unacceptable. Now, here's the thing. I knew for a fact that my property wasn't part of any HOA. I'd specifically asked my realtor about it, had my lawyer check the deed, and even called the county to confirm. No HOA covenants, no restrictions, no monthly fees. Just me, my land, and the freedom to improve it responsibly." "Ma'am," I said, walking over with my coffee still in hand, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my property, and I'm not part of any HOA." Janet turned her full attention to me, and let me tell you, it was like being studied by a particularly judgmental hawk. She looked me up and down, taking in my work clothes and muddy boots, and I could practically see her, calculating my net worth and finding it wanting. "Listen, sweetie," she said, using that tone that manages to be both condescending and threatening at the same time. "I don't care what you think you own. This creek is a community resource, and any work affecting it needs HOA approval. That's just how things work around here." I almost laughed, almost, but something in her tone made me bite my tongue and see where this was going. "The creek, in community property," I explained patiently. "It's a natural waterway, regulated by the state. I have all the proper permits for this work." Janet's eyes narrowed. "Permits? From who?" "The county. Because I can tell you right now, they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to environmental issues. Do you have any idea how delicate this ecosystem is?" Oh, the irony? Here I was, being lectured about environmental protection by someone who probably thought recycling meant buying a new handbag made from sustainable materials. "Actually," I said, "I do know a thing or two about environmental protection. This is erosion control work, designed to protect the creek from further damage." "Erosion control," Janet scoffed. "That bulldozer is going to destroy everything. The wildlife, the natural beauty, the property values. This is exactly the kind of reckless development that's ruining our community." Miguel caught my eye and mouthed, "Should I keep working?" I nodded slightly, because honestly, I was curious to see how far Janet would take this. She must have interpreted my nod as defiance, because she immediately pulled out her phone and started dialing. "Yes, I need to report illegal construction near Willow Creek," she said loudly, making sure we could all hear. "Yes, they have heavy machinery." "No, they don't have proper permits." "Well, they claim they do, but I'm sure they're not legitimate." While she was on the phone, I pulled out my own phone and quietly texted my assistant at the EPA office. "Heads up, you might get a call about my property. I'll explain later." Janet finished her call and turned back to us with a triumphant smile. "The county inspector will be here within the hour, and I've also called the state environmental office. They take water contamination very seriously." Miguel looked genuinely concerned now. "Boss, should we stop work?" "No," I said, sipping my coffee. "Keep going. We're completely legal." Janet's face turned an interesting shade of red. "Legal? Legal? You're going to destroy this entire watershed. Do you have any idea what you're doing to the migrating birds, the fish populations, the groundwater?" And that's when I realized that Janet Henderson, HOA president and self-appointed environmental warrior, had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. She was throwing around buzzwords like confetti at a New Year's party, hoping something would stick. "Miss Henderson," I said, "I appreciate your concern for the environment. Really, I do. But this work is actually going to improve the creek's health. We're stabilizing the banks to prevent sediment runoff, creating habitat for native species, and improving water quality." "Improve?" she shrieked. "You're going to improve a pristine natural creek with a bulldozer? Are you insane?" At this point, Miguel had started the dozer back up and was carefully grading the first section. The machine was so quiet and precise that it barely disturbed the grass 10 feet away. But Janet was acting like we'd brought in a strip mining operation. "This is criminal," she muttered, pulling out her phone again. "I'm calling the EPA." And that's when I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Because Janet Henderson, in her infinite wisdom, was about to call the EPA to report me, the person who literally ran the regional EPA office. "Ma'am, I tried one more time. I really think you should reconsider this. The permits are all legitimate, the work is environmentally sound, and you're not actually part of any HOA that would have jurisdiction here. Don't you tell me what I should reconsider." Janet snapped. "I have a master's degree in communications and 30 years of community organizing experience. I know environmental damage when I see it." A master's degree in communications. Not environmental science, not biology, not even general ecology, communications, and she was lecturing me about watershed management. The county inspector arrived first, a tired-looking man named Dave, who I'd actually worked with on several projects over the years. He took one look at the situation, nodded at me with recognition, and asked to see the permits. I handed over my folder of documentation, and Dave spent about 10 minutes reviewing everything while Janet hovered behind him like an anxious parent at a school play. "Everything looks good," Dave announced. "All permits are current and properly filed. The work is within approved parameters." Janet's face went through several color changes in rapid succession. But what about the environmental impact? What about the wildlife? "Ma'am," Dave said patiently, "this is restoration work. It's going to help the environment, not hurt it. The EPA already reviewed and approved the plan." "The EPA?" Janet's voice went up an octave. "Well, I called them to, and they're sending someone out." Dave looked at me with barely concealed amusement. "Really? Who did you talk to?" I called the main number and filed a complaint. They said they'd dispatch an inspector. And that's when a familiar vehicle pulled into my driveway. A white state SUV with Department of Environmental Protection emblazoned on the side. Out stepped Tom Richardson, one of my senior inspectors, looking slightly confused about why he'd been called to investigate his own boss. "Hey, Sarah," Tom said, walking over with a clipboard. "I got a call about some kind of environmental emergency. Something about illegal construction near a waterway." Janet's eyes lit up. Yes, that's exactly right. They're destroying the creek with that bulldozer." Tom looked at the dozer, looked at the permits in Dave's hand, looked at me, and I could see the exact moment when he put it all together. "Ma'am," he said to Janet, "I'm going to need to see some identification and understand your connection to this property. I'm the HOA president," Janet declared, pulling out her driver's license. "This affects the entire community." Tom examined her license, then looked at me. "Miss Henderson, according to this, you live at 2847 Maple Grove Lane. That's about 2 miles from here, and it's not part of any HOA that has jurisdiction over this property." Janet's confidence started to waver. But the creek affects everyone downstream. Environmental protection is everyone's responsibility." "You're absolutely right," Tom said seriously. "Environmental protection is everyone's responsibility. That's why we have permits, inspections, and trained professionals to make sure projects like this are done correctly." He paused, looking at his clipboard. "And according to my records, this project was personally reviewed and approved by the regional director of the EPA. In fact, he looked at me with a barely suppressed grin. "Sarah, didn't you sign off on this yourself?" The look on Janet's face was priceless, like she'd just realized she'd been lecturing a fish about swimming. "You single quotes you're the regional director." She stammered. "Sarah Martinez, regional director, State Environmental Protection Agency," I said, extending my hand. "And you just called my office to report me for doing permitted environmental restoration work on my own property." Janet's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But you look so young." "I'm 38, I said. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I have a master's degree in environmental science and a PhD in watershed management. This is literally what I do for a living." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the bulldozer seemed to pause out of respect for Janet's complete and utter humiliation. I was just trying to protect the environment," she finally whispered. "I know," I said, "and I meant it. That's actually admirable. But next time, maybe ask questions before making accusations. And definitely don't try to shut down legal environmental protection work." Tom was scribbling notes on his clipboard, mostly to hide his amusement. "Sarah, do you want to file a complaint for harassment?" I looked at Janet, who had gone from fierce environmental warrior to deflated soccer mom in about 30 seconds. "No, I think we're good, but Miss Henderson, you might want to stick to actual HOA business in the future. You know, like making sure people don't park their RVs on the street or paint their houses weird colors." Janet nodded mutely, then practically ran back to her Escalade. She was gone in another cloud of dust, but this time it felt more like a retreat than an arrival. Dave packed up his paperwork. "Well, that was entertaining. Sorry about the hassle, Sarah." "No worries. Better safe than sorry, right?" Tom lingered for a moment. "You know, I'm definitely putting this in the office newsletter. Regional Director reports self for environmental violations. Finds self completely innocent." I laughed. "Just make sure you mention that the work is actually going to improve water quality and create habitat for native species." Maybe Janet will read it and learn something. After everyone left, Miguel and I got back to work. The first terrace level was already taking shape, and it looked exactly like I'd envisioned. Clean lines, natural materials, perfect for the native plantings that would come next. "Boss," Miguel said during our lunch break, "in 30 years of doing this work, I've never seen anything like that." "Like what?" "Someone calling the EPA on the head of the EPA for doing EPA-approved work." I had to admit, it was pretty surreal, but it also got me thinking about how often people make assumptions based on appearances. Janet saw a young woman in work clothes and immediately assumed I didn't know what I was talking about. She saw Bulldozer and immediately assumed environmental destruction. The truth is, real environmental protection is complicated. It's not always about leaving everything untouched. Sometimes it's about careful intervention, strategic restoration, and working with natural systems to make them healthier and more resilient. By the end of the week, the first phase of the project was complete. The terrace bank looked like it had grown there naturally, and I'd already started planting native grasses and wildflowers. Miguel's crew had done beautiful work, and the creek seemed to approve. I'd seen more birds and even a family of deer coming to drink. About a month later, I got a call from the county planning office. Apparently, Janet Henderson had filed a formal complaint about my illegal construction and demanded a full investigation. They'd sent an inspector out, reviewed all my permits, and concluded that the work was not only legal but exemplary. The inspector mentioned that he'd never seen such thorough documentation or such careful attention to environmental protection. He also mentioned that the restored bank was already showing signs of natural recovery and that other property owners along the creek were asking about doing similar work. I never heard from Janet again directly, but I did hear through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd been quietly removed from her position as HOA president. Apparently, the other board members weren't thrilled about her calling in false environmental complaints and generally making their community look bad. The irony wasn't lost on me. Janet, in her misguided attempt to protect the environment, had actually tried to stop a legitimate environmental protection project. And in doing so, she'd encountered someone who dedicated their entire career to doing exactly what she claimed to care about. 6 months later, my creek bank was thriving. The native plantings had taken hold, the terracing was working perfectly, and the whole area had become a haven for local wildlife. I'd even added a small seating area where I could drink my morning coffee and watch the water flow past. But the story doesn't end there. Oh no. It gets better. About 3 months after the initial confrontation, I was at a regional environmental conference in the state capital. You know, one of those networking events where everyone wears name tags and pretends to enjoy rubber chicken dinner while discussing watershed management strategies. I was presenting on successful restoration projects when I noticed a familiar figure in the audience. Janet Henderson, sitting in the third row, frantically taking notes like her life depended on it. After my presentation, she approached me with a look that was equal parts sheepish and determined. "Miss Martinez," she said, "I wanted to apologize for what happened at your property. I've been taking some environmental science courses at the community college, and I realize now that I didn't understand what you were actually doing. I had to give her credit. It takes guts to admit you were wrong, especially when you made such a spectacular scene about it. I appreciate that, Janet, I said. What made you decide to take the courses? She looked embarrassed. After our encounter, I realized I was passionate about environmental protection, but didn't actually know anything about it. I was just repeating things I'd heard on social media and assuming I understood the science. This was actually refreshing. Most people who get caught making assumptions just double down and get defensive. So, what are you studying? I asked. Basic ecology, water quality management, and environmental policy, she said. I'm also volunteering with the county's stream monitoring program. They test water quality and document changes over time. Now this was interesting. Janet had gone from environmental Karen to actual environmental student. That's fantastic, I said, and I meant it. The stream monitoring program is really important work. Have you been assigned to any particular waterway? Actually, she said, looking even more embarrassed, I requested Willow Creek. I wanted to document the effects of your restoration work. I've been taking water samples upstream and downstream from your property every week since January. I almost choked on my conference coffee, and what have you found? The water quality downstream from your property is actually better than upstream, she admitted. Lower sediment levels, better dissolved oxygen, even some fish species that weren't there before. The restoration work it's actually working exactly like you said it would. This was the most satisfying I told you so moment of my entire career. But I tried to keep my expression neutral. Have you documented all this? I asked. Everything, she said, pulling out a thick folder. Water chemistry, photographic documentation, species counts, erosion measurements. I even got the county to let me use their fancy equipment to test for things like nitrogen and phosphorus levels. I flipped through her documentation, and I was genuinely impressed. Janet had turned into a meticulous citizen scientist. Her data was thorough, well organized, and professionally presented. This is really good work, I said. Have you considered submitting it to the county as a case study? Actually, she said, I was hoping you might help me with that. I know I don't have any credibility after what happened, but this data could help other property owners understand how restoration work actually benefits the environment, and that's how Janet Henderson, former HOA tyrant, became one of my most effective advocates for stream restoration projects. We ended up co-authoring a paper on community-based environmental monitoring, which got published in the state environmental agency's newsletter. Janet's transformation from obstructionist to ally became a model for how to turn environmental passion into environmental action. But the real plot twist came about a year later. I was in my office one Tuesday morning when my assistant buzzed me. Sarah, there's a Janet Henderson here to see you. She says it's about a potential environmental violation. My blood pressure spiked for a moment. Had Janet reverted to her old ways? But when she walked into my office, she wasn't wearing her power walking outfit or her indignant expression. She was in business casual, carrying a professional-looking folder, and she looked nervous. Sarah, she said, I need to report an actual environmental violation. And I think you're going to want to handle this one personally. She opened her folder and pulled out photographs, water quality data, and what looked like surveillance notes. Remember, the Creekside Meadows HOA, she asked. The one I used to be president of. I nodded. Double quotes. Well, the new leadership decided to do some improvements to the common areas. They hired a contractor to clear vegetation along the creek bank and install what they're calling aesthetic hardscaping. She showed me the photos, and I felt my jaw clench. Someone had clear-cut the natural vegetation along about 200 feet of creek bank and installed concrete retaining walls. No permits, no environmental review, no consideration for wildlife habitat. It gets worse, Janet continued. They're dumping construction debris directly into the creek. Concrete chunks, rebar, even some kind of sealant that's leaving an oily sheen on the water surface. The photos showed exactly what she was describing. This wasn't just unpermitted work, it was actively harmful to the waterway. How do you know all this? I asked. I've been monitoring the entire watershed as part of my volunteer work, she said. I noticed the water quality changes immediately. Increased turbidity, decreased dissolved oxygen, and I found dead fish about a quarter-mile downstream. This was serious, really serious. Janet, I said, you need to file a formal complaint immediately. This is exactly the kind of environmental damage that we have enforcement authority for. Already done, she said, handing me another folder. Formal complaint, all supporting documentation, and I've CC'd the county, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the State Attorney General's office. I stared at her. You CC'd the Attorney General. The HOA president is a lawyer, she said. He knows better. This isn't ignorance. It's deliberate. Within a week, we had a full investigation team at Creekside Meadows. The violations were so egregious that we issued an immediate stop work order and referred the case for criminal prosecution. The HOA was hit with $50,000 in fines and ordered to fund a complete restoration of the damaged area. The contractor lost his license, and the HOA president, the lawyer who thought he was above environmental law, ended up with a misdemeanor conviction on his record. But here's the beautiful part. Janet Henderson was hired as the project manager for the restoration work. Her documentation of the damage was so thorough and her understanding of the watershed so complete that she was the obvious choice. 6 months later, I was back at Creekside Meadows, but this time for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The restored creek bank was beautiful. Native plantings, sustainable erosion control, and habitat features that actually attracted wildlife instead of driving it away. Janet gave a speech about the importance of environmental stewardship and community responsibility. She talked about how real environmental protection requires knowledge, not just passion. She even mentioned our original confrontation, describing it as a learning opportunity that changed my entire approach to environmental advocacy. The audience laughed, but I could see that many of them were taking notes. Janet had become something of a local celebrity for her transformation from environmental antagonist to environmental expert. After the ceremony, as we were walking along the restored creek bank, Janet turned to me with a grin. You know, she said, I never did thank you properly for that day at your property. Thank me? I asked. You tried to shut down my project and called the EPA on me. Exactly, she said. You could have just told me who you were from the beginning. You could have pulled rank and made me look foolish. Instead, you let me make my case and then educated me about why I was wrong. She paused to watch a great blue heron that had landed in the shallow water near the bank. If you had just dismissed me immediately, I probably would have stayed angry and ignorant. But because you took the time to explain things, I realized I wanted to actually understand what I was talking about. It was a fair point. I'd been so focused on the irony of the situation that I hadn't really thought about the educational opportunity. Plus, Janet continued, watching you handle that whole situation with such professionalism made me realize what real expertise looks like. You weren't defensive or aggressive. You just knew your stuff and let the facts speak for themselves. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water flow over the carefully placed stone structures that would prevent erosion while maintaining natural flow patterns. So, what's next for you? I asked. Actually, Janet said, I'm thinking about going back to school, getting a real degree in environmental science. Maybe even applying for a job with the EPA eventually. I smiled. We could always use good people who understand the importance of community engagement. Is that an offer? She asked. It's an encouragement, I said. You've got the passion, you've proven you can learn, and you've shown you can communicate with people who might not understand environmental issues. That's a valuable combination. A year later, Janet Henderson was enrolled in a master's program in environmental policy. She'd gotten a scholarship based on her community conservation work and her published research on citizen science monitoring. She still sends me water quality reports from Willow Creek, and she still volunteers with the county monitoring program. But now she also gives presentations to other HOAs and community groups about responsible environmental stewardship. The Creekside Meadows incident became a case study in environmental enforcement that we use in training programs. But more importantly, it became a story about how people can change when they're given the opportunity to learn, rather than just being shut down. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been who I was. If I'd been just a regular homeowner trying to protect my property, would Janet have succeeded in shutting down my project? How many other people had she intimidated with her fake authority and environmental buzzwords? It's a sobering thought, because the truth is, there are a lot of Janet Hendersons out there. People who mean well but don't know what they're talking about. People who mistake loudness for expertise and assumptions for facts. But here's what I learned from the whole experience. When someone challenges your right to do something legal and responsible, don't back down. Know your facts, have your documentation, and stand your ground. Because sometimes the person screaming about regulations doesn't actually know what the regulations are. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person they're screaming at knows a lot more than they think. But more importantly, I learned that people can change. Janet went from being an obstructionist to being an advocate, from being ignorant to being informed, from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. It just took someone willing to treat her like a person who could learn, rather than an enemy who needed to be defeated. The creek is still flowing past my property, cleaner and healthier than before. The wildlife is thriving, the bank is stable, and my morning coffee tastes just a little bit better knowing that I've made a positive difference in my little corner of the world. But the ripple effects of that confrontation continue to spread in ways I never expected. Last month, I got a call from a reporter at the local newspaper. Apparently, someone had nominated my restoration project for the state's Outstanding Environmental Stewardship Award, and they wanted to do a feature story. Who nominated the project? I asked. Actually, the reporter said it was a group nomination. The Creekside Meadows HOA, the County Stream Monitoring Program, and something called the Willow Creek Watershed Alliance. They all submitted supporting documentation. The Willow Creek Watershed Alliance. I'd never heard of it. It turns out, Janet had started the Alliance, a nonprofit organization focused on protecting and restoring the entire Willow Creek watershed. She'd recruited property owners, local businesses, and even some of the original Creekside Meadows HOA members who had been horrified by the illegal construction incident. The Alliance had been quietly working on restoration projects up and down the creek for the past year, using my property as the demonstration site to show other landowners what was possible. We've completed 12 restoration projects so far, Janet told me when I called her about the nomination. Everything from simple bank stabilization to full habitat restoration. And we've got 15 more projects planned for next year. That's incredible, I said. How did you fund all this? Grants mostly, she said. It turns out there's a lot of money available for community-based environmental projects. You just have to know how to write the applications and document the impact. Janet had become quite the grant writer. Apparently, she'd secured funding from the State Environmental Agency, the EPA, and even some private foundations focused on watershed protection. But the real kicker came when she told me about their latest project. We're working on a demonstration site at the old Creekside Meadows common area, she said. You know, where the illegal construction happened. The HOA decided to turn it into an educational facility. Educational facility? Yeah, like an outdoor classroom. We're creating interpretive trails, information kiosks, and a small amphitheater where we can do presentations about watershed ecology. We're calling it the Henderson Environmental Learning Center. I nearly dropped the phone. There, naming it after you. The current HOA board insisted, Janet said, sounding embarrassed. They said it was important to acknowledge how the whole mess got turned into something positive. I tried to talk them out of it, but they were pretty determined. The irony was almost too much to handle. Janet Henderson, who had started as the environmental villain of this story, was now getting an environmental learning center named after her. There's something else, Janet continued. We want to feature your restoration project as the centerpiece of the educational program. Would you be willing to give occasional presentations about professional environmental management? And that's how I ended up becoming a regular speaker at the Henderson Environmental Learning Center, teaching weekend workshops on stream restoration, watershed management, and environmental permitting. The workshops became surprisingly popular. We'd get everyone from homeowners planning their own restoration projects to college students studying environmental science. Even some professional contractors started attending to learn about best practices. One Saturday morning, I was setting up for a workshop on erosion control for homeowners when I noticed a familiar face in the audience. It was Miguel, the contractor, who'd been operating the Bulldozer that fateful day when Janet first confronted us. Hey, boss, he said after the presentation. I wanted to thank you for what you did that day. Thank me? For what? For standing your ground, he said. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and I've had plenty of people try to shut down legitimate projects because they didn't understand what we were doing. Usually, the property owner just caves and cancels the job rather than deal with the hassle. He paused, looking out at the restored creek bank visible through the learning center's windows. But watching you handle that situation, staying calm, explaining the science, showing the permits, it taught me a lot about how to deal with those confrontations. I've used your approach on 3 different projects since then, and it's worked every time. Miguel had started bringing his own documentation to every job site, not just the permits and plans, but educational materials explaining the environmental benefits of the work. He'd even created a simple fact sheet about erosion control that he could hand out to concerned neighbors. I've had the HOA presidents try to shut me down this year, he said. But instead of just arguing with them, I gave them your fact sheet and offered to explain what we were doing. Both times, they ended up becoming advocates for the project. This was exactly the kind of ripple effect I'd hoped for. Miguel was now educating people about environmental protection as part of his regular business practice. There's something else, Miguel continued. I've been thinking about getting some formal training in environmental restoration. Maybe even getting certified as a restoration contractor. You know of any good programs? I smiled. Actually, Janet Henderson is starting a certification program through the community college. It's designed for contractors who want to specialize in ecological restoration work. Miguel's eyes lit up. The same Janet Henderson who tried to shut down our project. The very same, I said. She's come a long way. The certification program was actually Janet's master's thesis project. She partnered with the local community college to develop a curriculum that combined practical construction skills with ecological science. The goal was to create a pipeline of contractors who could do restoration work properly without the environmental damage that sometimes comes from well-meaning but poorly informed construction projects. The program was so successful that other community colleges started adopting the curriculum. Within 2 years, Henderson Certified had become a recognized credential for ecological restoration contractors throughout the state. But perhaps the most unexpected development came about 18 months after the original confrontation. I was in my office one morning when my assistant buzzed me with an unusual request. Sarah, there's a call for you from the Governor's Office of Environmental Policy. They want to discuss something called the Community Environmental Leadership Initiative. The Governor's Office. That was unexpected. The caller was the Governor's Environmental Policy Advisor, and she had an interesting proposition. Ms. Martinez, she said, we've been following the work you and your community partners have been doing in the Willow Creek watershed. The governor is very interested in scaling up this kind of community-based environmental protection statewide. Apparently, word had gotten all the way to the state capitol about our little local success story. The combination of professional expertise, community engagement, and measurable environmental results had caught the attention of some very important people. We're launching a new initiative to support community-led environmental projects, the advisor continued. We want to provide grants, technical assistance, and policy support to help other communities replicate what you've done in Willow Creek. The initiative would provide funding for community groups to hire environmental professionals, support training programs like Janet's certification course, and create a network of demonstration sites where people could see successful restoration projects in action. We'd like you to serve as the statewide coordinator for the initiative, the advisor said. And we'd like to use your property and the Henderson Learning Center as the flagship demonstration site. It was an incredible opportunity, but I had to ask, what made you choose our project as the model? Honestly, the advisor said, it was the story. The fact that you turned a confrontational situation into an educational opportunity, and that your opponent became your strongest advocate. That's exactly the kind of community building we want to encourage. The governor's Community Environmental Leadership Initiative officially launched 6 months later, with Janet and me as the co-keynote speakers at the announcement ceremony. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of environmental professionals, community leaders, and policy makers, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd all come from that dusty morning when Janet first confronted my bulldozer. Environmental protection isn't just about regulations and permits, I told the audience. It's about people. It's about building understanding between neighbors, between communities, and between people with different perspectives on how to care for our shared environment. Janet spoke after me, and her presentation was about the importance of combining passion with knowledge. I learned the hard way that good intentions aren't enough, she said. If you really want to protect the environment, you have to understand the science, respect the expertise of others, and be willing to admit when you're wrong. She paused, looking directly at me. But most importantly, you have to be willing to learn, because the moment you stop learning, you stop being effective. The audience gave her a standing ovation, and I felt a surge of pride for how far she'd come. After the ceremony, as we were walking back to the parking lot, Janet turned to me with a familiar grin. You know, she said, I've been thinking about that day at your property a lot lately. Oh yeah, what about it? I keep wondering what would have happened if you had been just a regular homeowner instead of the EPA director. Would I have succeeded in shutting down your project? It was a question I'd asked myself many times. Probably, I admitted. If I hadn't had the expertise and the authority to back up my position, you might have been able to intimidate me into stopping the work. That's what scares me, Janet said. How many good projects have been shut down by people like me? People who meant well but didn't know what they were talking about. And how many bad projects have been allowed to continue because people were too intimidated to speak up? I countered, it goes both ways. We walked in silence for a moment, both thinking about the complexity of environmental protection in a world where everyone has an opinion, but not everyone has the knowledge to back it up. I think that's why this initiative is so important. Janet said finally, it's not just about doing more environmental projects. It's about creating a culture where people feel empowered to ask questions, seek out expertise, and work together instead of against each other. She was right. The real success of our story wasn't just the creek restoration or the learning center or even the statewide initiative. It was the model we'd created for how people with different perspectives could work together to solve environmental problems, because at the end of the day, we're all sharing the same planet. We're all downstream from someone else's decisions, and we're all responsible for the legacy we leave for future generations. The question isn't whether we care about the environment. Most people do. The question is whether we're willing to do the hard work of learning, listening, and collaborating to actually make a difference. 3 years after that first confrontation, I'm still living in my dream home by Willow Creek. The restoration project is thriving. The Learning Center is booked solid with educational programs, and the statewide initiative has funded over 100 community-led environmental projects. Janet is finishing her master's degree and has been accepted into a PhD program in environmental policy. She's also been offered a position with the EPA's Community Engagement Office, which she's seriously considering. Miguel has become one of the most sought-after restoration contractors in the state, and his Henderson certified credentials are now required for most state-funded restoration projects. And the creek is healthier than it's been in decades. The water runs clear, the fish populations are recovering, and the wildlife corridor we created has become a model for other watershed restoration projects. But the real measure of success isn't in the water quality data, or the species counts, or even the awards and recognition. It's in the relationships we've built and the understanding we've created, because environmental protection isn't just about saving trees or protecting water quality. It's about creating communities where people can disagree without becoming enemies, where expertise is respected but not worshipped, and where everyone has a role to play in caring for our shared home. Sometimes it takes a bulldozer and a very determined HOA president to teach us that lesson. But once you learn it, you never forget it. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person screaming at your bulldozer might just become your most valuable ally in protecting the environment you both love. The creek is still flowing past my property, cleaner and healthier than before. The wildlife is thriving, the bank is stable, and my morning coffee tastes just a little bit better knowing that I've made a positive difference in my little corner of the world. As for Janet Henderson, I hope she's learned something from our encounter. Maybe she's channeling her environmental passion into something more productive, like actual education about watershed management or supporting real conservation efforts. Or maybe she's just moved on to harassing someone else about their landscaping choices. Some people never change. But one thing's for sure, she never forget the day she tried to stop the EPA from doing EPA work and got schooled by the person who literally runs the EPA. Sometimes karma has a sense of humor, and sometimes, just sometimes, it shows up in the form of a bulldozer and a very well-informed coffee drinker.